In his communication to the House, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Thomas Tayebwa, revealed to the MPs that the European Parliament has written to his office warning Uganda and Tanzania against dropping the East African crude oil pipeline. The same motion equally advises European Union member countries not to render any diplomatic, financial or any other support to Uganda's oil and gas projects. The motion is premised on allegations of potential environmental impact, unfair compensation of landowners, human rights abuses and climate change.
It is prudent to say that Uganda's oil projects will exacerbate climate change. Yet it is a fact that the EU bloc with only 10% of the world's population is responsible for 20% of global emissions. And Africa with 20% of the world's population is only responsible for 3% of global emissions.
Uganda and Tanzania in February signed an agreement with CNOOC and French oil giant Total to construct a 1,443-kilometer crude oil pipeline running from Kabale in Hoima district to Chongoleani in Tanga in Tanzania. Since then, there have been efforts, especially from Europe, to have the project stopped.
There are over 9,000 oil and gas production licenses in the USA, including plans to drill in Alaska and the Arctic Sea. 53 licenses have recently been issued in the North Sea, and Germany has also revived its coal plants. In addition, Western countries are seeking to import gas from African countries, and this is in a bid to ensure energy security in their respective states. Is energy security a reserve for only the European Union? Does Uganda not have the same right to have energy security?
Members of Parliament now want an engagement with stakeholders to ascertain why the foreign states are interested in matters of an independent country.
Because the investment is high, and probably we expected some of the market from the European Union, and now if they are like, stop it, we are just worried about the cost of our oil.
Since we have a representative here, please engage with them and try to understand. Because what was speaker, there are two issues. One, it is the companies from those countries, some of whom are engaged in exploration, their own companies. But also, we are getting some of the monies used in these processes is from them.
The said motion is yet to be brought to the attention of government of Uganda. The Minister for Foreign Affairs, John Mulimba, says they will cross the bridge when they get there.
Hello, thanks for staying with us on Sunrise at Sea this morning. Welcome to the Twitter Jabster. My name is Agi Uwase, and we are continuing the conversation in regard to the European Union resolution on the East African crude oil pipeline that will be taking place. The president of this country mentioned starting 2025. That is in 3 years' time. And joining me at the center of this conversation is Ms. Brenda Akankunda, and she's a trade and investment policy analyst with SEETVSunrise Uganda. Good morning, Brenda.
Good morning again. I'm glad to be here once again.
Thanks for coming once again. To start with, in the issue of EACOP now, as an investment policy analyst, what are your thoughts on this?
If the question is directly EACOP, I think first of all, one of our greatest aspirations as a country and as a continent is to see how best we can be able to develop, and how best we can drive our industrialization. And for me, I think that the EACOP is one of those engineers that can lead us into that economic growth that we've always looked forward to. So I think that on the outlook, without going into the nitty-gritties, the EACOP is one of those projects where we can be able to exploit our rich resources, and in the long run, it would have an impact on the livelihoods of the Ugandans.
Yes. And now looking at the resolution by the European Union condemning, the East African crude oil pipeline at the moment, that has also been met by, criticism from the government, different stakeholders. What do you think of this?
I think it's a very controversial discussion here. One is when you look at the resolution and the way it is framed, because it mainly talks about human rights violations, within the investments in fossil fuels. Now, for us as Siatini, we've always had a campaign that is dubbed Life Before Profit, saying that within all investment schemes, we need to put life of the people, of the citizens, before we think about the profits that come with the investment. However, I think that the EU is using human rights as a smokescreen for energy imperialism. So on one hand, we do apprehend that human rights is something that we really need to address. When you look at the resolution, it talks about some of the pertinent issues that we've actually always advocated for. Due diligence talks about issues to do with land displacement. It talks about issues to do with the protection of the environment. And these are very key issues. Issues that are not just within the energy sector. Issues that are literally in all the investment schemes that we have in a country. And these are the key challenges that we often see. We've often seen people lose their land. We've seen a lot of human rights injustices with no access to remedy. We've seen NGOs being closed because of probably civil and political interests. So I think that the EU, yes, it is really important that they address these pertinent issues, but I think that it is biased in a sense when it only looks at one particular angle. And I think that is why we've really had this whole debate from the different citizens of Uganda, not just government trying to defend the project itself.
Yes.
But adding on is, I think, for us to try and see what could be the justification. And for me, the core, which I think is a push for the EU, is something to do with energy transition, because what we have to agree to is the fact that climate change is real, and it's at this time that we really must focus on how best we can be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Yes.
Energy transition being the core. And we see the EU particularly putting in place a lot of strategies to be able to transition. But I think the question today should be whether as Uganda or as Africa at large, whether we are actually prepared to transition so that we are not just being superimposed into a narrative that is not even our narrative, but rather for us to go with what is an EU narrative as opposed to maybe something that is Afrocentric. So I think that the points in there are justifiable when it comes to addressing human rights within investment schemes. That one we cannot even have a debate about it. Yeah. But I think that when we talk about some of the key sectors for development, we really need to be critical and look at what are some of maybe the viable alternatives that we could address to ensure that on one hand, we say protect the environment, but also on the other hand, we are able to meet our aspirations for development and growth.
Now we do see, and just like some of you've mentioned some of them, the European Union did mention that this pipeline will pass near Lake Victoria, and it threatens to contaminate water supplies, harm wildlife, and they also warned that the project would displace over 100,000 people. Now these allegations, the government of Uganda as well as the government of Tanzania have dismissed these allegations. So do you think there is a communication gap?
First of all, I cannot speak like I represent the government, but I am under the assumption that for such a huge project, there is definitely an environmental and social impact assessment that has been carried out. And I see the resolution actually re-echoes that environmental impact assessment. And I want to believe that when that impact assessment is carried out, the risks are highlighted. And I want to assume that a mitigation plan must have been put in place. Maybe this is a time where we need to actually now call up the government and ask them that if these facts are actually true, then what is the alternatives? Because we cannot stand in a situation where we see that the livelihoods are at a high risk and then we keep quiet, maybe as civil society. So I want to believe that whatever, and I think it touches something that you asked, the information gap, because some of the claims that have been coming out is there's that information gap. We as citizens do not have enough information, yet the information is actually there. Maybe this is a call to the government for them to be able to actually come out and justify that whatever is being addressed, the risks are those that have actually been captured in the impact assessment that was carried out. and then they are able to speak out and let us know how best they intend to mitigate some of those risks.
Yeah, and speaking of that, there's so many people who have been talking about government is actually withholding important information. That is what has triggered the European Union to come on and say, you know what, cards on the table, this is what will happen when this project actually takes shape. So is the government really withholding important information from Ugandans in regard to this project?
Well, legally, for me, I think that access to information is a right that as citizens we are really entitled to. And if we as citizens feel that there is information that is actually being withheld, which I know in a lot of times, even when we have certain projects within certain investment schemes, access to information remains a huge gap. And I think that as citizens, as civil society, we need to take upon the mandate on ourselves. And maybe that is where we can look at the other pathways through which we can be able to attain the information. Because I know that the courts are open for us to be able to access that information. But a call still to government that that right particularly to access to information is really something that needs to be put out there. And actually, Aggie, information is not just even from the government side. Access to information, even ourselves, making an effort to be able to get the information. A lot of times, us that work mainly with within the investment schemes, especially with the workers, you realize that the workers, for instance, do not know where they can be able to access remedy in case of a violation. Do they go to the High Court? Do they go to the Magistrate Court? So it is, I think, I would say a capacity gap that some of us have made an effort really to address and see how best we can be able to build the capacity of everyone that needs this information. Information not just relating to maybe such huge projects, but information that has an impact on the livelihoods of all the Ugandans and all the citizens.
But in regard to this particular project, the governments of Uganda and Tanzania are actually denying these allegations. They're calling them allegations of, 100,000 people will be displaced, and then the negative impact of this project on the environment and the fact that the pipeline will be passing all through Lake Victoria. That is a very, it actually is a dangerous thing for the environment. So the fact that they are denying these allegations, it means they are not ready. I would think it means they're not ready to put all the information for every Ugandan to actually know, and maybe they're scared of criticism and people, saying the project is not a good thing, and it looks like the government has heavy interest in this project.
Okay, I wouldn't point it out that they are denying the allegation. I think that government is also making their case because apparently this pipeline is in Uganda and Tanzania. So one position has it that these are the facts, and government is coming out to say that is actually not true. So I think we need to give them a listening ear so that they can be able to justify. If they deny that those allegations are not true, then they need to come out and tell us what is the actual information. Because even as us as citizens, it is an alarm that, there is a high risk that livelihoods could be lost. But lastly, you had talked about interests of government. Yes. Which is so factual because there's a lot of revenue that we intend to generate from this particular project. So definitely the government has to be interested. And that takes you back to something that I started with, that right now our major challenge, we see climate change is really something that we must be worried about. But we also can't go away from the fact that some of our development needs, what is actually happening right now, the status quo is that unemployment, poverty per se, is at a high rate. So the government will definitely do whatever it takes to ensure that it can be able to meet that aspiration of development.
Now, speaking of yes, again, how it can be detrimental to the environment, the oil pumped through the pipeline will yield 34 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, and that is yearly. Now, do you think this poses a risk to nature?
Yes, it does. And I think, like I told you earlier, the whole discussion around fossil fuels definitely has an impact on the environment. And as we move towards energy transition, this is something that we must tread carefully. But I also think that sometimes we are not really being realistic, especially when you look at, for instance, the carbon emissions that Africa as a continent is emitting. We see that it is as low as 3% as of now. And right now, we need to look at how best we can ensure that, yes, we still get the oil, but on the other hand, we put in place mitigation measures. We have put in place these national determined contributions. There's a lot of effort that is aimed at ensuring that we stop emitting the carbon. And I think that this is a place where we should actually be putting an effort, because today we cannot wake up and say we are transiting to renewable energy, because we do not have what it takes. Yes. And even now, when we see the EU coming out, there's a controversy that it is the same EU that is actually extracting the minerals from Africa, minerals that they use to, say, manufacture their hydrogen batteries. And today, as Africa or as Uganda, we are not really making any effort. Even the discussions that we have at a regional level, at a continental level, have not captured in anything to do with energy transition. We have a whole discussion around the African Continental Free Trade Area, but still discussions at the African Union, but still we do not see any discussion towards energy transition. And it's not because this is being ignored, but it's rather because our aspirations as Africa today are towards addressing those development needs. I think that when we try to follow what the EU, because the EU has what it takes, yes, but as Africa, we are still making an effort. So I think that we need to be given time to be able to transit, because right now, we are looking at how best we can exploit our resources to be able to meet the development needs. So when we say we leave the fossil fuels untampered, then it has a huge impact on our economy. And we are trying to struggle with issues to do with the indebtedness of our country. So this is one of the projects that actually would look at and say, if we are able to generate resources, then this would be a good way we can deal with the indebtedness of our nation.
Now, apparently 20 banks and 13 insurers, including Allianz Group, Swiss, and then HSBC and BNP Paribas have said they will not support the pipeline due to the controversies around it. And, you know, I mean, coming from the European Union, and then what other people, civil society organizations and, you know, other stakeholders have to say in regard to this EACOP. Doesn't this pose a threat to the project?
It poses a threat, but I think it's actually about that time that we talk about who is financing our development and how Africa should be able to finance its own development. Over time, what happens is that the issue around financing has actually been really controversial, that whoever finances comes with their own demand. So maybe this is an opportunity for us to look internally as how Africa can be able to finance its development needs, how we can be able to finance our transition. Maybe a time for us to look at the African Development Bank or other alternatives through which we can be able to finance our own development or to finance our own energy.
Now, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Right Honourable Thomas Tayebwa, last week said and condemned this resolution by EU. And actually, this is what he said. He said, termed it as the highest level of neo-colonialism and imperialism by European countries against Uganda and Tanzania. What do you think of this?
Aggie, what I think is that the worst form of dependence is policy dependence. I think that, of course, as the United Nations recognizes sovereignty of states, sovereignty goes to a bit of policy independence. And I think that, well, I know that the resolution is really not binding, but I think that as a state, as Uganda, and I saw even the president put out a call that we shall still go on and exploit our oil, I think that the sovereignty of the state is something that should never be underlooked. So it is justifiable in that particular aspect that as Uganda, we should be able to choose what we think is good for Uganda and not to be decided for in that particular sense, so that we have our policy dependence.
Yes, but then again, some Ugandans are arguing that this is double standards because you're only calling them imperialists and racists when, you know, they're trying to sabotage a project. But then again, you're always depending on them for, you know, all this aid and, you know, funds every other time and again.
I really think that our interest as Ugandans right now should be looking at the substance as opposed to the form, in an aspect of us not focusing on words like those, but rather looking at the implications, for instance, that the resolution could have on Africa. And maybe that is where our focus should be, not us to debate maybe words, particular words that are quoted. I think that the major concern right now should be the implication, one like you pointed out, that yeah, whereas this may not be binding to us as a country, it may have implications on the financiers. So yes. I think that our focus should be right there, but also not forgetting the fact that, yes, there is that dependence which we have, and we need to rely on.
We actually hugely depend on, you know, on them.
Yes,
that's a fact.
Yes, and that is wrong. You see, as Africa, even this whole discussion around energy transition, right now the only narrative that we have in place that we are depending on is an EU narrative. But that narrative speaks towards the aspirations of the EU. It doesn't speak towards our aspirations. That is why I was telling you that us as Africa, the African Union, should be able to come in place with its own narrative that addresses the particular challenges that we face as a continent and puts in place mitigation measures. But if we keep relying on the North, then we end up losing the beat where we are, because for instance, we are not at the same development level. So the EU, which by the way is a major polluter, has reached at a certain point. It has built industries, and right now it feels it needs to transit, and it has the capacity. And as Africa, our capacity is still lacking. But beyond that, we are still a continent that is facing huge challenges, development challenges. Our major drive today is we aim at industrializing and you know, boosting our economy. So right now we need to sit and come back to the drawing table and be able to put in place our own narratives. I think it's about that time where we go away from depending on narratives that are not Afrocentric and we make our own. That way we can even be able to look at how best we can achieve our goals as the African continent.
Don't you think it's a little bit too early? Because if we are, you know, largely depending on them financially, creating our narratives is a good thing. But don't you think it's a little bit too early since we are not really independent at the moment?
I think we don't depend on the EU. You know, if you actually
on
look
the
at
European countries,
if you look at the statistics, you realize that it's actually the EU that depends on Africa. And let me tell you this: for over 40 years now. What the relationship for Africa and the EU has majorly been defined by extractivism, looking at who does what with Africa's minerals. Yes. And I will tell you that even today for the EU, it even recently put out the fact that 70% of what is needed for them to transit will be got from the third parties, not within the EU. And when you look at the statistics, it shows you that 90% of the resources needed for energy transition are being exported to the EU. So I do not really believe that we are dependent on the EU. I think
on the European countries?
That we both, yes, I think that we both complement each other. And that is why we both have the powers to actually sit on the table. Because when you look at most of the agreements, for instance, that we have in place, the trade agreements, most of them have needs as opposed to what we are getting from the EU. Even if it's the smallest things like coffee, we realize that you're going to find out that most of the European Union countries do not even have a coffee tree. But they are the largest coffee, you know, producers, or they're exporting coffee even more than we are doing. So I really don't believe it when you say that we are highly dependent on them. But I think we both complement each other, and that is a relationship. Because the EU is strong, we as Africa also need to look at how best to put in place Afrocentric Afrocentric narratives that speak towards our aspirations.
Okay, yes, and we also do see the European Union insists that no banks or financiers who currently fund Total should ignore their responsibility, and they should be prepared to meet increasing pressure too until they stop financing climate bombs like this around the world. Now, in your opinion, is it that bad?
Yes, it poses a threat. And I think this is something we've actually talked about. It poses a threat to do with financing. And I think that for us to be able to develop, financing is one of those key sectors or areas that we must address. But still, like I told you earlier, I think that, I saw the president put it out there that if Total decides to pull out, then he will be able to get other investors into it. But whereas this decision is not binding, I think that financing is something now that actually as a country we need to look at. If, say, Total is not, into this project because it has decided to pull out, then we look at how best we can still be able to go on with a project, but look at alternative means of financing. And like I told you, maybe look internally. How best can Africa or can Uganda be able to finance its own projects, development projects? Yeah.
But do you think that it's a climate bomb, as you know, the European Union is putting it or stating it out there, or they are just exaggerating the whole situation?
No, there is a climate threat.
Yes,
there is, and I think that is why right now, like I told you earlier, the discussion around mitigation and adaptation should really be, at the forefront, because we cannot do away with the fact that, it will have an impact on the climate. And we're already seeing huge implications to our climate, not related to the project, but beyond. We are seeing, and even the outcomes, by the way, affect us as Uganda, as Africa highly, as opposed to maybe how the impacts of climate change could affect the EU. Today, if it rains highly, it is our roads that get swept away, not the EU roads. But I think that still going back to, climate change, environment protection vis-a-vis meeting our development aspirations. I think that let's focus on how best we can be able to mitigate and adapt and see how we make this more environment friendly.
And also, as we wind up the conversation, as a Ugandan and as an investment policy analyst, do you think that the EU has a right to meddle into Uganda's gas and oil projects?
Well, I don't know if I would use the word meddle, but one is, of course, there's the sovereignty like I talked about. So whichever decision is made by the EU, it is definitely not binding. But also, we cannot run away from the fact that over time there are strong relations between Africa and the EU, because actually you realize one of our major markets beyond Africa is the EU. So there's a relation, and I think that whenever the EU comes in place to give maybe an advisory opinion, it is something that we cannot underlook. Just that we need to sit at a table and either agree or disagree, and it is not that probably what they say out there has to be binding, but I think that we need to look at how best we can better our relations as Africa and EU, but also still ensure that we address these pertinent issues, like the EU points them out, issues to do with human rights, because if we do not have a protection for if we do not prioritize the rights of the citizens, then there's a huge gap. And before I go off, I want to note that for me, this is in my interests and as Siatini, because over time we've called upon a government to ensure that the investment policies that we have in place protect and respect human, economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. So this call ideally comes in place at a time when we realize that most of our investment agreements are skewed towards the protection of the foreign investors. And I think it's about that time that we actually revisit our investment policies, starting with our national law, the investment code, and look at how best we can ensure that it addresses some of those pertinent issues like due diligence, because those are really lacking. And if we can be able to address those gaps, and still look at even the project, the EACOP project itself. How best are we, for instance, protecting the rights of the citizens there? This resolution talks about the free, prior and informed consent. We need to go on ground and actually ascertain whether whoever is affected by this particular project actually had their consent to this, you know, because there is a lot of land displacement. I know there is compensation, but do we have the consent of these particular citizens? So those are really critical issues that we must address, but not forgetting the fact that, of course, as a sovereign state, we have the right to make our own policies, but adhering to some of those international recognized standards of protection of livelihoods is really something that we cannot underlook.
Yes, and also as we wind up the conversation again, one of the biggest concerns, especially with Ugandans on social media, is how will this benefit every Ugandan? And we are talking about every Ugandan, from people in Kampala to all the way to Kabong, I mean, everyone.
Well, that is in very many ways. There are some that are direct and some that are indirect. And maybe let me, in fact, they're actually direct. One, of course, the key aspect is revenue. And the principles of revenue, one of them is redistribution. That if this revenue is generated, it is meant to be redistributed to the economy in terms of infrastructure, which is a thing that we've really been looking out, or putting the resources in other social services. So I think that if well done, this is a great opportunity that would benefit a lot of Ugandans. But also directly, I see right now that the EACOP is going to employ over 60,000 Ugandans. So that is really a direct benefit that I think that is a huge number, and it comes in place to address one of the challenges that we have as a nation, which is unemployment. So basically, those are the main challenges, rather the main benefits that I think, if well done and well implemented, this project could actually be a huge project that could lead to the development of us as a nation.
Okay. Well, I would like to get your final remarks in regard to this, all EACOP conversation.
My final remarks specifically to the resolution is that, one, as a country, let us not just wash away what the resolution says, especially looking at the aspects where it talks about human rights within investment. I don't agree with the fact that it just talks about investment in the fossil fuels, but we'd rather broaden it to investment schemes within Uganda, because these are challenges that we have over time seen, and look at how best now we can put our policies right so that they can address these particular challenges to do with human rights and environmental protection. But two, I would also want to say that this particular project is something that we need to really look at and not forget that there's a growing narrative of energy transition. So we need to come back to the table and see how best we can meet our development needs, but also make an effort towards transiting to renewable energy.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Brenda, for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Aggie, for having me once again.
Okay, this has been Ms. Brenda Akankunda, and she's the Trade and Investment Policy Analyst with CNT Uganda. And she's been weighing on the matter in regard to the European resolution on EACOP. Well, that is all we had for you in this segment of the Twitter Jabs. Do not go anywhere. Coming up is our views, and we are talking trauma dumping. This is Sunrise at Sea. Don't blink.